Welcome to Vicharshal Yatra, where we talk about rationality, scientific temperament, and humanity. Today, we're tackling a tough one. It's a perspective voiced by many and, well, explored really deeply by thinkers like Christopher Hitchens. We actually had a listener request to dig into this idea that religion is fundamentally a damaging force in the world. And to do that, we're going straight to a key text. Hitchens' very powerful, often provocative book, God is Not Great: How Religion Poisons Everything. So our mission here in this deep dive is really to unpack some of his core arguments, understand his reasoning, and just see where his analysis takes us. And joining us to help navigate this, well, let's be honest, complex and potentially sensitive material is our expert.
Thanks. Yeah, it's definitely a significant book.
Yeah.
And that central idea that religion poisons everything, it's incredibly strong language, isn't it?
It really is.
So when Hitchens uses a word like poison, what specifically is he getting at? What parts of life does he think are being negatively affected?
Well, right off the bat, he doesn't just zero in on the obvious things like, religious wars, although he certainly discusses those. He seems to argue that the very foundation, the way religion operates, inherently leads to bad outcomes across many areas. So for him, it's not just about, say, the bad actions of some religious people, but something more fundamental about belief itself.
Okay, so it sounds like he's arguing it's a systemic issue, not just like isolated incidents or bad apples.
Exactly.
He's not just listing examples of violence. He's trying to get at something deeper about the nature of religious belief. Now, one of his early points, I think, is about where religion comes from in the first place. What's his view on its origins?
He's very clear on this. He sees religion as entirely man-made. No ambiguity there.
Okay.
He looks at the sheer number of different faiths, the constant arguments and schisms within them, and basically asks, look, if this was all divinely inspired, wouldn't there be, well, more agreement?
Right. So that diversity, those contradictions, he sees them not as maybe different paths to truth, but as evidence that humans just made it all up.
Pretty much. He highlights the human fingerprints, you could say, all over the doctrines and practices.
Which makes sense if you think about how cultures develop, right? Belief systems often reflect very specific times and places.
And this leads him straight into another huge point, maybe the core of it all. The link, or lack thereof, between morality and religion.
Ah, yes, the idea that you need religion to be good. He challenges that head on.
He really does. He leans on thinkers like John Stuart Mill, who criticized religion for valuing things that don't always connect to actual human well-being.
Mill called them fictitious excellencies, I believe. Can you unpack that a bit?
Sure. So, as I understand it, Mill, and Hitchens follows this, saw religious systems often focusing on things like, say, performing specific rituals correctly or holding certain beliefs very strongly.
Things that aren't necessarily about being kind or fair to others.
Exactly. It's like prioritizing dogma over basic decency sometimes. And Mill went further, didn't he? Looking at actions attributed to God in some texts.
Yes, finding them morally, well, eminently hateful, as Mill put it. It's a direct challenge to the idea that these texts offer a perfect moral compass.
Absolutely. If the supposed source of morality acts questionably, what does that say about the system?
It definitely complicates the claim that religion is the foundation of ethics. Now, you mentioned Hitchens does get into the more overt examples of conflict.
Oh, yes. And the examples he picks are quite stark. Northern Ireland, for instance.
Right.
The divide there was so pervasive that even atheism got labeled. You had to know if someone was a Protestant atheist or a Catholic atheist.
Wow. That really shows how deeply embedded those identities became, overriding everything else.
It fuels that us versus them mentality.
Then there's the Bosnian War.
Just horrific. And Hitchens points to the religious symbols used by perpetrators. Yes, images of those carrying out ethnic cleansing wearing Orthodox crosses or displaying pictures of the Virgin Mary. It's deeply unsettling.
It suggests how religion, even if not the sole cause, can be co-opted, twisted to dehumanize others, and frankly, justify atrocities.
Precisely. It's not always the root cause. The politics and history are complex, but it becomes a powerful tool for mobilization.
And the Rushdie affair, that was another key moment he analyzed.
Yes, the global reaction, the fatwa against Salman Rushdie for Hitchens, that highlighted how certain religious interpretations directly clash with freedom of speech.
And what struck him, I think, was how even some secular voices seemed to prioritize avoiding offense over defending that fundamental freedom.
It raises real questions about the chilling effect religious authority can have.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And finally, in this cluster of examples, he looks at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, focusing on Hebron.
He frames a significant part of that conflict as stemming from these ancient competing religious claims to land.
Claims rooted in Scripture, basically.
Right. Claims that continue to fuel very real violence and resentment today. It shows how these ancient narratives still shape modern geopolitics.
It's obviously a conflict with many layers, political, historical, but you can't ignore the religious dimension, the sacred sites, the deep-seated beliefs tied to that land.
So beyond these real-world conflicts, Hitchens also turns his critical lens onto the religious texts themselves.
He doesn't hold back there either, does he?
Not at all. He digs into the Bible, the Quran, pointing out what he sees as, well, inconsistencies, contradictions, and passages that seem to endorse violence or oppression.
Like the different creation stories in Genesis.
That's one example he uses, yeah. But he also raises ethical flags about parts of the Old Testament.
The commands for massacres and things like that.
Exactly. He brings up Thomas Paine, who was outraged by those passages centuries ago. Hitchens is basically asking, how can these texts be a consistent moral guide?
It's a challenge to their perceived inerrancy and moral authority. He also looked at the New Testament's development, right?
Yes, he notes that some familiar stories about Jesus seem to be later additions, suggesting, again, a human hand shaping the narrative over time.
That's where textual criticism becomes relevant scholars, studying how these texts were actually compiled and edited. By highlighting later editions, he implies they aren't necessarily direct, unchanged divine words.
And when he examines the Quran, what are his main points there?
Well, one thing he finds suspicious is the insistence that the Quran is only truly the Quran, only perfectly understandable in Arabic.
He sees that as a bit
It's
limiting for a supposedly universal message.
kind of exclusionary, yes. If it's for everyone, why the linguistic barrier?
Yeah.
He also draws parallels between the justifications for early Islamic conquests and other religious wars.
Seeing a pattern of human ambition dressed up in religious language.
That seems to be his argument. And then there's his take on miracles. He's famously skeptical.
Extremely skeptical. He finds most miracle claims lack credible evidence, calling them rather tawdry sometimes.
He even talks about his own involvement in debunking the alleged miracles of Mother Teresa.
Right. He felt the evidence presented for her sainthood was incredibly weak, yet the process went ahead. For him, it showed faith overriding facts.
A triumph of belief over empirical evidence, in his view. He also contrasts religious explanations for things like natural disasters with scientific ones.
Yeah, like some might see a hurricane as divine wrath, while science explains the meteorology. He uses that old anecdote, too, about the plague.
The one about the clergyman noticing the plague didn't care if you were pious or not.
Exactly, hinting that natural causes were at play, not divine judgment. And he brings in David Hume on miracles, too.
Hume's classic argument, yeah. Basically, the evidence for the laws of nature is always, by definition, stronger than the evidence for a miracle, which violates those laws.
So rationally, Hume argues you should never believe a miracle report.
Now, Hitchens goes into even more provocative territory when he asks, he asks if religion constitutes child abuse.
Yeah, that's probably one of his most controversial points. He's very direct about it.
What's his reasoning there?
He argues that indoctrinating children with intense fear, like fear of hell or guilt about natural thoughts and feelings, and forcing them to accept irrational beliefs, well, he believes that can be deeply harmful.
Harmful to their psychological development and their ability to think critically.
Yes. He mentions how teachings about things like masturbation or impure thoughts can leave lasting scars. He even cites Mary McCarthy's memoirs about her strict Catholic upbringing as an example.
It's a really strong charge, stemming from concern about how vulnerable children are and the potential long-term damage from instilling fear and irrationality.
And he doesn't stop there. He also explores historical links between organized religion and some pretty harmful political ideologies.
Like fascism.
Exactly. He points specifically to the Catholic Church's perceived sympathy for some fascist movements in the 20th century, and especially its concordat, its agreement with Nazi Germany.
He sees that as evidence that religious institutions aren't always a moral bulwark against tyranny, but can sometimes accommodate or even align with it.
He even uses modern North Korea as a kind of secular example exhibiting religious-like dynamics.
How so?
He suggests the intense cult of personality around the Kims, the rigid hierarchy. It has echoes of older traditions like Confucianism and ancestor worship, reinforcing totalitarian control.
Interesting. So even without a formal God, you can get these quasi-religious structures propping up authoritarianism.
And of course, he addresses the long and tragic history of religious persecution, especially anti-Semitism.
Right, highlighting how both Christian and Islamic traditions have, at various times, fueled hatred and violence against Jewish people. A stark reminder of the dark side.
Definitely. But despite this incredibly bleak picture he paints, Hitchens isn't entirely pessimistic. He does offer an alternative path.
Which is?
Reason, critical thinking, secularism. He sees these as humanity's best hope. He champions figures like Spinoza, Hume, Darwin thinkers who advanced rational inquiry.
So he believes that real progress, ethical and scientific, happens independently of religious faith, often even in opposition to it.
That's the core of his positive case, yes. Progress comes from human reason and effort.
Okay. So, wrapping up our deep dive into God is not great, it's undeniably a powerful, unflinching critique. We've touched on his arguments about religion being man-made, its effects on morality and conflict, his textual criticisms, skepticism about miracles, concerns about childhood indoctrination, and those historical links to harmful ideologies.
It's definitely not a comfortable read for many, and it forces you to confront some fundamental questions about religion's role. His bottom line is a call to move towards reason and secular values as a better foundation for society.
Absolutely. And this discussion is really just scratching the surface of his arguments.
For you, the learner, we really encourage you, if this interests you, to maybe engage with Hitchens' book directly. Consider his points, see what resonates, what challenges you.
It's part of that ongoing conversation about belief, reason, and human progress. What did you find most compelling or perhaps most difficult in his critique?
That ongoing reflection is really key.
And perhaps a final thought to leave you with, something Hitchens' work really pushes us towards. If we accept his critique, or even just parts of it, if we imagine moving beyond traditional religious frameworks, how do we cultivate morality? How do we build strong communities? How do we find meaning?
Those are fundamental human needs.
They are. And thinking about how to meet them robustly in a secular context is a major challenge that Hitchens implicitly poses. It certainly prompts some deep reflection.